Hello and welcome to the Airline Weekly Lounge. I'm your host Gordon Smith and I'm joined as usual by co-host Jay Shabbat. In this week's show, we're taking stock ahead of what promises to be a fascinating Q3 earnings season.
Hi Gordon, how's it going?
Doing very, very well, thank you. Can you believe it? Q3 is upon us already in terms of earnings season, that is. Congratulations to all who have made it this far and commiserations, I guess, to Play Airlines. Since we recorded last, we unfortunately saw the Icelandic ULCC collapse quite spectacularly. The writing had been on the wall, depending on who you were speaking to and what tea leaves you were reading. But it was still very, very sad to see a lot of passengers who were disrupted by that, not to mention the job losses directly and indirectly. Our thoughts go to everyone who's impacted by the collapse of Play there, Jay. But we do have the Q3 numbers coming in with Delta, as is traditional. As we're recording here on the 7th of October, they'll be reporting on Thursday, October 9th, Jay. Tell our listeners, just as we're setting the scene here ahead of Q3 earnings season, not just for the US Big Four, but also more globally, what are the key factors? What are the topics that you think our listeners and our readers at Airline Weekly should be keeping an eye on?
Well, before moving any further, I would also like to extend my good wishes to you and your family and friends for a happy and healthy third quarter earnings season. And I should also wish you a happy birthday.
Thank you, Jay. I was considering, because 1989, for full disclosure, that was the year I was born. Revolution was in the air, in various parts of the world. You don't have to be a historian to learn that. And I did have a little look at our good friend Wikipedia to see what were the airlines established in 1989, to see who I share my birthday with. This isn't particularly October 1989, but there were actually some big names. Do you want to hear any of them, Jay?
Yeah, of course I do. Yeah, who shares your birthday?
Who doesn't share my birthday is the question. A lot of these, I should say, are now defunct, but they were for a time quite significant. Some highlights for you. This is not an exhaustive list before anyone writes in and says, why didn't you say XYZ? Cape Air, Croatia Airlines, Eurofly, EVA Air. We had Hainan Airlines, Nouvelle Air, the Tunisian carrier, Pegasus Airlines, very successful now, Turkish LCC, Sun Express, Trans-Maldivian Airways, and the Trump shuttle. That's certainly one that didn't last too long. Quite an interesting year for aviation there.
Yeah, very much. We have to have a group for the ones that survive anyway. We have to have a group birthday party. I'll get to work planning that.
Well, enough about ancient history, because I'm definitely getting to the ancient history point of my time on Earth, I think. But let's have a look at what's coming up, Jay, because we've got those numbers coming out of Delta on Thursday, but of course, just the first of many Q3 earnings that we are preparing for. Tell our listeners what they need to know. Tell our listeners what key trends they should be looking for, not just in the numbers, but also in those valuable comments that we get from the senior executives or the earnings call too.
Sure, and in the very broadest sense, nothing revolutionary here, but of course, any start of a new earnings season is a good opportunity to learn just how demand is trending and how supply is trending. Now, I'm going to focus this conversation today on the U.S. just because it's Delta that's going first, and then we'll have a couple other U.S. airlines that follow. And that is, as we get deeper into earnings season in subsequent weeks, we'll start to hear more from the European airlines and Asian airlines and airlines elsewhere in the world. So a couple of things that will be interesting to hear as Delta presents. One of them is, we do have this government shutdown that's happening now, where a lot of government employees are not working, which means most are not traveling. And there's different, not every government worker is idled, but a big chunk who might have traveled or not. And if I recall from a previous government shutdown or shutdowns, there's a couple of them last decade, there were a few airlines that did say that they were affected. I remember Southwest, I believe, was saying that the federal government is actually one of their largest customers. Remember, don't quote me on this because I'm misremembering, but I thought they had said that the federal government is actually their single biggest customer for Southwest. Even if that's not exactly true, it's surely going to be a very big customer just because think about how national in scope they are, how national in scope an airline like Southwest is, and think about their big operation in a place like Baltimore, Washington, and even, I want to say even Denver and Kansas City. These are places with very big federal government operations. So it'll be interesting to see if Delta makes any comment about that, that is causing any kind of demand distress for any of the airlines, particularly in a they're not particularly big in Washington, as big as say Southwestern American in the sort of Baltimore, Washington area. But still, we'll see if they say anything. And then separate from demand, there's also the impact of air traffic controllers who are working, but there are reports of people calling in sick because they're not getting paid on time. And if you'll recall from the last big government shutdown, I don't know if it was 2018, 2019, something like that. I believe it ended when a bunch of air traffic controllers called in sick. And that's when a lot of people in Congress and their constituents got really upset that their flights were canceling. And right after that, the shutdown ended. So we'll see if, air traffic control in the airline industry is again going to save the day. So I'll stop there, let you, follow up. But that's one thing of many that are on my mind going into Q3 earnings season.
Thanks for that, Jay. And we should give a shout out to Meghna Maharishi, who's a regular contributor on the show over at Skift, our airlines reporter there. She's been doing some great write ups on the airline specific impact of the US federal government shutdown as that drags on, Jay.
Just as I was talking, I was scrolling through the latest jobs report from the Department of Labor. Now, the September jobs report was actually never published because of the shutdown. But if you look at the August jobs report, there are about, looks close to 3 million federal government employees. But then there's about 5 million state government employees and about 15 million local government employees. And if you're wondering why that number is so large, a lot of that is because local governments in the United States run most of the school systems. So that's public school teachers, but it's also, police and firefighters and things like that. So just for a little bit clarification of the government's role in the US economy, federal government has a much smaller employee footprint than state and local, as you were kind of saying before, Gordon.
Got it, Jay. Thanks for that additional insider insight. It can feel a little bewildering as an outsider looking in, trying to make sense of it all. And that certainly helps things out on my side. And it is a fast moving situation. So keep an eye on skiff.com. A reminder, as always, that Airline Weekly subscribers get access to all the airline news included in their Airline Weekly subscription. So no excuse for not checking that out. Between issues of Airline Weekly proper, Jay, let's take a look at some of the other topics that should come up in Q3 earnings season, particularly among the US major airlines. Transatlantic has been a huge theme, certainly since the tail end of the pandemic, with a lot of strength and particularly in those premium cabins. But there were inklings earlier in the year that main cabin, whatever you want to call it, economy class, may be weakening. That's certainly one thing that we'll be keeping an eye on, particularly with the Deltas, Uniteds, and Americans of this world.
And I think the message from the US airlines when we last heard from most of them, which was about a month ago, roughly speaking, there was that. Do you remember that Morgan Stanley conference, Gordon, that we wrote
I
quite
do.
about?
The Laguna conference over in California.
Yes, that's the
That
one.
was a great source. Every so often you just get one of these, be it a Barclays event or something else, and they sound really dry. And you think they're called industrials events, industrials conferences, and so on. And there's not actually a huge amount put out about them in advance. You might get a little market statement or something saying Executive X is going to appear at location Y, webcast here. But they don't make a big song and dance about it. But actually, Jay, I'm sure you've listened into far more of them than I have over the years. They can be incredibly useful sources of information, particularly between earnings calls.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, this one was very much so, and a lot of the transatlantic was indeed a big topic for. It's basically Delta, American, United that do most of the transatlantic flying among U.S. carriers, but then of course you do have JetBlue doing some as well, and Alaska is going to jump into that market too. Big question mark whether Southwest decides to do something. We'll leave that question aside for now. But the general message at that Morgan Stanley event was that transatlantic over the summer was disappointing. I mean, Delta certainly said they said transatlantic was actually their weakest entity, like geographic entity. I don't know if they were including domestic in that, but compared to Asia and Latin America, they said it was doing worse. I don't think it was necessarily that things were, horrible or falling off the table or anything. I just think that, premium was holding up pretty well, but there was a lot of weakness in the back in the economy class. So that was definitely an issue that they flagged. They did, however, Delta and United and I think American would all pretty much said this, that the even though there was weakness in, let's say, a month like July, which is traditionally a very peak month for transatlantic travel, even though it was kind of weak, the a lot of the demand is now dispersed across and into the shoulder seasons, what we call the shoulder seasons. So, like right now, for example, we're talking on October 7th. So here we are, early-ish, mid-October. The apparently there's demand. A lot of demand has moved into this period, and some of that has to do because summers have gotten really hot, and some of it has to do with like changes in school schedules in the U.S. and you can go on and on. Some of it is because more people are now working at home. There's a larger retiree population with savings that are willing to travel. They're not confined to traveling just during summertime, school breaks, and on and on. But the big question, when Delta reports in a couple of days here, again, we're talking on Tuesday and they're going to be reporting on Thursday. So probably as you're listening to this, you will either have heard Delta already or the call is about to start. So they will hopefully give some insight. I'm sure they will, on whether or not that expected strong transatlantic demand is actually, coming through for them. So we'll see. But, there are some reasons to worry, not just based on some of the bearish comments from the summer, but also if you look at some of the things that have happened to the US dollar. I mean, a very strong US dollar was a big engine, the demand strength across the Atlantic and even across the Pacific and to other, places, Latin America, whatever, Middle East, Africa. A lot of Americans were just, traveling all over the world abroad in part because of the strong dollar. And the dollar has really weakened a lot over the past year or so. So that could be a kind of a dampening effect on transatlantic demand. I did want to flag some numbers from Finnair that came out today. Now, you already flagged, Gordon, earlier, just a couple moments ago, that Play wound up going out of business. Now, they, probably not too representative of anything else. They've had, very specific issues of distress, but certainly raises the point that demand probably wasn't coming in great for them on their transatlantic routes. In fact, they were just down to one or two, I think, by the time they collapsed. I did see Finnair's numbers across the Atlantic looked horrible for September. I don't recall off the top of my head if there was anything last September that was unusual or anything. So, I think that requires a little bit of a deeper dive before drawing any conclusions here. But it certainly, you know, kind of made my eyes pop out of their sockets when I saw that their load factor for September was 8 points below what it was last September. And that on 6% less capacity too. So it's not like they threw a whole bunch of seats out there. So not a very pretty picture there. Again, is Finnair, extremely representative of what's going on across the Atlantic? Not really, but it's maybe should ring a few bells of alarm. So all that's to say that we go into Q3 earnings season with a little bit of concern for the transatlantic market.
We sure do, Jay. And it's worth saying that Finnair did point to more capacity going into Asia, Far East, their traditional destinations. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya were named, and load factors there were actually up just shy of 3%. And that's, of course, without the far north, Siberian shortcut flying over Russia. They're going the long way around, like most other Western carriers at this point in time. That's a story that we've discussed many times on the podcast and elsewhere. But yes, certainly showing that there is still some interest in flying with Finnair, despite the convoluted route that you need to fly through, Jay. Any other quick sort of Q3 earnings season tidbits that you want to put in before we head into the break?
Well, I think one big theme that we're going to hear a lot is the whole Spirit question. And going into, or let's go back to that Morgan Stanley Laguna event. I think one of the big takeaways from all these U.S. airlines was that demand was not so great in the summer. It was getting better going into the fall, and most importantly, or just as importantly, capacity was falling a lot. And if from everyone from Delta to Frontier to JetBlue are all talking about how things should be a little better in the fall because the so much capacity is coming out. I mean, we'll talk in part two in a bit, a little bit more about some capacity trends, but Spirit is, just really a shadow of its former self and just continues to take out more and more capacity. I should mention, since we're talking about Spirit, that since we last spoke on this podcast, Gordon, Spirit managed to subject to final bankruptcy approval and all that, but looks like they managed to secure what's called debtor in possession financing. And without going to too much detail about what that is, it's basically gives you the right to promise new lenders that you'll be first to pay back if we, when you put all the other lenders from earlier behind you in line. So it kind of incentivizes investors to throw more money at the airline.
Like a
To
super IOU.
Yeah, I like that term. Yeah, that's a good way to put it, Gordon. The super IOU. So they were able to secure more capital in the form of lending from a lot of existing creditors took advantage of that, which means that more than anything else, it just buys them time. If you asked me, before they secured this additional capital, if I thought that Spirit was going to survive, I would have, said that there was probably a good chance that they wouldn't. But getting this extra capital is a huge step because it buys you time to just undertake more restructuring. So they're going to take out a ton more aircraft. They're going to rework labor contracts. I'm sure they're going to rework a whole bunch of supplier contracts. And now, they're in a position where if they can achieve a like a very competitive cost advantage, and remember that everybody else's costs, including Spirit pre-bankruptcy's cost, everybody else's cost has gone up a lot. So if they can suddenly get themselves to where their unit costs are just much lower than anybody else's, then here we are. Spirit's going to have they're going to be in a very interesting position to perhaps become successful again. Now, there's a lot that has to happen between now and then,
Oh, yes.
but they are definitely in a much better position now than they were just a couple weeks ago.
Well, that brings us beautifully into the break, Jay, because we're going to be discussing Q4 capacity trends for the US big airlines in part two. Before that, quick reminder to send any questions or comments that you might have for us to podcast@skift.com. That's podcast with an S at the end. And please don't forget to follow or subscribe to the podcast, wherever you're listening or watching. And if you are enjoying the show, please rate us 5 stars or leave us a positive review so we can continue to spread the word about the Airline Weekly Lounge. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Hello and welcome back to the Airline Weekly Lounge. I'm Gordon Smith, joined as usual by co-host Jay Shabbat. Part one, we were discussing at Q3 and the earnings season, which is approaching rapidly as we're recording here, October 7th. We are turning our attention briefly in part two, that is, to Q4, specifically capacity trends, Jay, because you've been crunching the numbers thanks to our good friends at Cirium Dio for the source of the hard data, looking at Q4 2025 US capacity trends amongst the big carriers. Tell our listeners what they need to know. Tell our listeners what were some of the more interesting nuggets that you discovered.
Sure. So what I did was I ran using that DO database that you referred to. I ran the top 10 airports for every U.S. airline and whether or not they're up or down for this upcoming fourth quarter or the current fourth quarter. Here we are already versus last year. So I guess I'll start by mentioning Spirit. So Spirit's capacity, their seat capacity, is down about 27%, but that's gonna even be a steeper drop as we move forward, probably into the first quarter, second quarter, because they're getting rid of a lot of airplanes. So keep in mind that they're already down 27%. I think we said a couple of weeks ago, I don't remember if it was on the podcast or writing in the newsletter, that Spirit just grew tremendously from where they were in 2019. So they were at some point, and they were kind of back to where they were in 2019 and probably going to be even smaller coming forward. So that's a little bit about Spirit. And then if you want to, kind of look at where they're reducing their capacity, it's less in Fort Lauderdale, which is their busiest market, less in Orlando, which is their second busiest market, And they're actually up in Detroit, which is their third busiest market. But then in places like Las Vegas and Atlanta and Dallas Fort Worth, they've just basically, they've been tearing that down. So let's move on from Spirit. So let's look at the big three. So Americans' capacity, their seat capacity is going to be up 3% this quarter. United's going to be up 5%. United, that's been kind of a theme over the past couple of years where United's kind of grown ahead of their rivals. And then Delta's going to be up only about 2%. And nothing really too terribly exciting in terms of where the big three are growing, not growing, with a couple of exceptions. And one of them is Chicago. There's a nice war going on. I don't know, is that probably shouldn't use those two words together, nice and war. But what I meant to say was there's a fateful, maybe exciting, maybe maybe even bloody war going on between American and United at Chicago O'Hare Airport. So Chicago is American's going to be up 26% there. They're really trying to they've always kind of played second fiddle at O'Hare Airport, and they're trying to kind of win back some business. And then United itself is up about 8%. So keep an eye on that
Yeah,
battleground.
26 is a huge number for a relatively mature base.
Yes, yeah. And they've added some international, so that's a lot of seats in some of the bigger aircraft. But yeah, absolutely, they're really going at it. And I should say that Southwest is also a major player in Chicago but over at Midway Airport, and they're actually going to be a little down. Their Midway operations are going to be down a little bit by about 1% this quarter.
A rounding error. Jay, any other nuggets from the others?
Sure. Let's see. Who do you want to know about? Frontier is kind of interesting because they're, trying to pick up the pieces with as Spirit downsizes. And they're actually going to be down as well by about 1%. But there's also a lot of variance between, where they're growing, where they're shrinking. Their biggest market is still Denver. That's their hometown where their headquarters are. Denver's going to be down 10% for them. But interestingly enough, they're growing 61% in Atlanta. So they, always a dangerous endeavor to take on Delta in its fortress. But I guess the reasoning there is that, as I mentioned earlier, Spirit is down 36% in Atlanta. So I guess they think they can, pick up some of the spill from Delta, when Delta's full on peak days and, you know, or people looking for a cheaper flight or whatever, they can, maybe make that work. So they've got they're throwing a lot of eggs into the Atlanta basket. A couple other places that they're growing. They're up a little bit in Dallas too. I mentioned Spirit was shrinking there, and they're going to be up 45% in Los Angeles. So Frontier is looking for some West Coast action.
And
We'll
that's
see.
just to clarify, that's Los Angeles LAX International, not some of the fringe metro airports.
Correct. Yep. At LAX airport. But then you have some of the smaller airlines like Allegiant. They'll be up total 11%. Sun Country is going to be down 11%. I think they're a little capacity constrained on the passenger side. They're moving some of that stuff over to cargo where they have the opportunities. Breeze is a much smaller airline, but Breeze has more seats than Sun Country nowadays, but they are still in growth mode as more planes arrive. They're going to be up 44%. They're doing a little bit of an international push now, some short haul international Caribbean stuff. And then if you look at just all of the airlines in the US ranked, American is still the airline with the most seats at about 69 million this quarter, about 70 million, I guess, rounded off this quarter. And they'll be up about 3% total, as I mentioned. I think I mentioned that number before. The next in line is Delta in terms of number of seats. And then Southwest actually has more seats than United. And then in fifth place is the combined Alaska Hawaiian, which is also growing, but not much by about 4%. So there you have it. Right behind there, JetBlue, then you get Frontier, then you get Spirit and Allegiant, Breeze, Sun Country, and Avelo, which is shrinking now. There are your largest US airlines. Do you want to hear the busiest US airports?
Oh, go on. Yeah.
Okay, number one, Atlanta, which is going to be about flat. So that's despite Frontier growing, as I mentioned, Spirit shrinking there. Delta, what is Delta doing in Atlanta? Let's see. Delta is about up 1%. So not a whole lot of action there for Delta at its giant, super profitable fortress hub. Chicago is the second busiest airport in the United States, ranked by scheduled seats. And as I mentioned, for reasons I mentioned before, we're going to see 11% growth there. Number three, sorry, Dallas, Fort Worth, which is going to be flat. Number 4, Denver, up 2%. Number 5, LAX, despite Frontiers, big growth there. Total LAX seats down 1%. So I threw a lot of numbers at you there, Gordon, but I think that gives you kind of a general picture of how we're trending capacity-wise going into the fourth quarter.
A fine scene setter, Jay. We've covered Q3 earnings season and also some of those capacity trends for Q4, which of course we are in already. Thank you for that. And a quick reminder that if you're looking for any additional insights from Barry Biffle, he joined us last month at the Skift Global Forum in New York City. Really fun interview there. Certainly one of the highlights for me. Go on to skift.com. You can see the full video and transcript of that. And also a couple of the names you mentioned, Jay, Allegiant and also Breeze, not to mention JetBlue as well. Leaders from all of those airlines will be joining us in Fort Worth, Texas on December 3rd for the Skift Aviation Forum. Go to live.skift.com for all the details there. And in the spirit of airline-related events, we've got the Skift Global Forum East, where we will have the Etihad CEO, Antonualdo Neves, and the Oman Air CEO, and we'll also have the CEO of Abu Dhabi Airports, amongst others. Some really big names from the broader travel sector. Go to live.skift.com if you want to join us in Abu Dhabi at the end of October. Lots going on, Jay. Really exciting stuff. Thanks for joining me on the show today and it's giving us that lay of the land. A quick reminder as well that as a Airline Weekly subscriber, you get access to all the airline news on skift.com, plus Skift Research's airline reports. Go to airlineweekly.com/subscribe and get a free trial issue. In the meantime, thanks to Jay for joining me this week, and thanks as always to our producers, Monica and Will, and wherever you are in the world. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time. Bye for now. Whether you're listening to us on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts, please make sure to subscribe, rate us 5 stars, or leave us a positive review. This really helps us get the word out about the Airline Weekly Lounge, so we can continue to bring you this podcast every week, absolutely free of charge. And if you're watching us on YouTube, make sure to subscribe to the Skift channel and hit the notification bell to find out whenever a new video drops.